Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker on issues of architecture and architectural thinking, and what we are really trying to do is to advance the frontier of architectural thinking into realms that are futuristic, beyond the contemporary, and beyond in many ways the pragmatic. Today we are talking about things that are both pragmatic and beyond the pragmatic. This is my conversation with my colleague Elizabeth Golden, who has recently written a book on the resurgence of use in contemporary in traditional materials. But our discussion is far-ranging, encompassing issues not just of structure and use and capacity building, but also the potential, let's say, spiritual qualities of traditional materials. I hope you enjoy. Here we go. Thank you for being on Architecture Talk.
I'm excited.
So Elizabeth, I'm very interested in, and you've got a book and you've just done a lecture, and you are actively promoting whatever we want to call it, this idea of traditional materials, vernacular materials, or materials that have been used for a long time. And it seems to me the idea, from my takeaway of it, so I'm hoping you to be corrected, is that the way I read your argument is that something like traditional materials shouldn't be relegated to the rubbish heap of distant places and histories, but that indeed should be studied and considered of relevance and of value to modern, or let's say contemporary and future architectural thinking. And I know that you particularly talk about bamboo and rammed earth, and is this, how would you summarize your argument?
I think you've summarized it fairly well, but I really want to stress that I am looking at contemporary architecture.
Yeah.
So for me, I really started looking at the materials mainly because I was just fascinated to see them starting to be, again, I feel like there's really been a resurgence of interest.
Right.
And I'm sure you've seen it also in India. But from the side of the architect, to really kind of go back and look and see how could we start to work with these materials in contemporary architecture. So it's not that I'm studying the materials in and of themselves, because actually in my book I don't divide the book by materials. I actually divide it by what they do and how the architects engage with them and use the attributes of the materials to achieve certain things.
Right.
And so I'm really looking at that sort of moment now of how architects are starting to, not even starting, but it's been going on for a while, but how they're able to combine these now within contemporary systems.
Okay, that sounds, so you're focused more on sort of contemporary uses of this material.
Yeah.
And from there I assume you must have some thoughts about future possibilities about these things. Where do you think, from your thinking and your practice, where do you think this can go, and you might want to possibly illustrate that with some example or thoughts you might have?
Well, I think I see it going in a couple of directions, and I'm both optimistic but also pessimistic at the same time.
Really?
Because in doing this study, I've found that we are in this transition period where there are many countries that were they're moving into being industrialized, and that's sort of registering in the architecture, right? And when you start to study that, you see that there is this loss. And so it seems daunting, you know, to overcome or to try to bring back certain traditional methods within this sort of industrialized system.
So it's a losing proposition.
It seems like it's
at the large scale.
You know, on the one hand, it seems like it's a losing proposition, but then on the other hand, I see then there are architects from, you know, in different countries that are starting to find ways to revive these methods, and it's not something yet that I see like, oh, it's a global thing and it's happening everywhere, but you know, I do see architects really becoming interested again in these methods, and I think that for me, so I don't know yet. I mean, I really think there's
jury's out. Yeah.
The jury's out, but I'm hopeful, and I'm also excited to see, you know, people like Francis Carré and Vautrin Niha and, you know, Al Bourdet starting to become known as part of it
for working in this way.
Yes, for working in this way.
Yeah. So what for you is the key importance of, you know, working in this way? I mean, why don't we just, you know, build in new ways because they work, and, you know, what's the why do it?
Why do it? I think it depends on where you're doing it. There's no silver bullet, and that's what I have found also through the research, that there are different reasons for doing it.
Right.
In some cases it might be because you want to engage the local community in capacity building and have them be a part of the process.
Right.
It might be that you want to build sustainably in your country, and that material is available. And it actually makes more sense to use that material because it's plentiful.
So you're talking about this in the context of like third world conditions, or do you think it's relevant for anywhere?
Well, I actually never use the word third world.
Okay, what is your term?
And I never use the word developing either. I mean, I think of it as like industrialized or newly industrialized, or...
I mean, is it relevant for us here in Seattle?
No.
No.
I don't, you know, and people ask me this, and I'm really bothered by it, actually.
Okay.
Like, people ask me, like, can you translate this for the United States? And I don't know, like, actually, I personally, that's sort of the next thing that I want to do, is try to find a way to work using local materials in a really contemporary way in the United States.
Right, right.
So that's something that I would like to do, and there are a few examples, of course, but I think it's applicable, and that's where it goes back to the examples that I show in my book.
Yeah.
Europe, for example.
I mean, you show Herzog and de Meuron.
Herzog and de Meuron. I mean,
everybody knows about that, right?
Yeah, and so in the United States, I think there's just a fixed way of thinking about building, and it always comes down to money. And so now I haven't found, and I looked, I mean, I really tried to find examples that I could use, and there's one, it's a straw bale co-housing community that's on Lopez Island that I included, that Methuen did several years ago.
Okay.
And they chose that material because it was available locally, and it was also an opportunity to bring people together. But there's not so we can think of architects in the United States that use earth, for example. So Rick Joy has done houses made out of rammed earth. Yeah. And even Olsen Kundig, they've used the material too, but I'm not really so...
Eastern Washington.
Yeah, and I'm not so interested in that. You know, I think it's great if they use the material, but it doesn't really do anything in those buildings, and I really set the parameters for my research is to look for places where the materials were used in multiple ways. So they tempered the environment, they supported the local economy, and that they weren't just these sort of inert substances, but that they worked in multiple ways and were integrated within the project in that way. So
it's like you also talk about the cultural life of materials.
Right. Right.
I mean, sort of that it's important that they be community and culturally integrated. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be in every case. Like, for example, the Herzog and de Meuron, it's not about like capacity building. It's more about the the way that it works thermally, and there is some connection actually culturally to the area where that building was built. And it was also sort of part of the corporate identity of Ricola to use that material because it's sustainable. So there's these sort of multiple things going on. So that's why, I mean, as much as I love Rick Joy
Sure. Beautiful work. But
yeah, it's beautiful, but it's not doing what I was really interested in, kind of elevating and
So give us your favorite example of something that works in multiple registers very effectively, which one could look towards as a not as a model, no, as a sort of example of embodied and embedded practice.
I think one that comes to mind where I do see it having a very large impact or effect would be if you look at solid wood construction in the Vorarlberg region of Austria. There's a really long tradition of woodworking there, and now there's also been a kind of development where craftspeople, artisans, industry, and architects work together to create architecture out of wood. And the evolution of solid wood construction really can be traced back to this kind of mass, log cabin type architecture, and there is this sort of development. So there really is a kind of cultural connection there, and so one of the projects that I looked at for the book was by Bernardo Bader, and so he actually goes and harvests wood himself, and then he works with local craftspeople to build his house. That's the example that's in the book, and just the way that it's connected to the place, and that material is very sustainable. It supports the local economy, and it's very much tied to local culture. I think that for me is an example of that sort of. It's an embedded practice.
Okay, I mean, one of the, let's say, problems I have with some of recent work that I see is how, in spite of its very different use of materials, how nevertheless it ends up looking clean line modernist. And my question is, has modernism become our universal cultural aesthetic practice? Is that good? Is that bad? Or would you think that there is some kind of a emerging or possible future relationship between how people work with materials and what kind of aesthetic forms we may look at?
I think it's a really good question, and I'm wondering if the way I answer this, if this is, when you say modernism, do you actually mean something that projects the Western ideal of architecture?
In part, sort of this clean line, unornamentalized, slick.
I am not interested. I'm not interested in form, actually. Form for me is secondary, and so, of course, the material will have some impact on the form.
Right.
That's that's sort of my personal feelings about it. But to answer your question, it's cultural, and so if somebody,
what's cultural?
I think what's cultural is this desire for the Western ideal, the Western ideal for a house that's clean, a house that looks modern, a house that looks like a house in California, and you might find that same house in somewhere in the Philippines, and you're going to see it probably in India. There might be slightly changed, but there is a sort of identifiable, like, what does this modern house look like? And so so the materials do get covered, and I wouldn't say that that's right or wrong, but I think if that's what people desire, and yet there's still a potential to use a material that comes from that place and is still connecting to something that's there, and that, you know, crafts people can be involved in it, and instead of importing a lot of you know, cement or
Right.
steel, I don't know. I would say then it's okay to have a hybrid. It doesn't have to be perfectly
Sure.
pure. And I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, it's an open-ended question, and it's you know, I don't think there's sort of a clean formula to how to think about
But
it.
I mean, I've talked about it before. If so, for example, in Niger, the project that we did in Niger,
The
of course,
Niamey, yeah.
So the history there, they have a very long history of working with mud brick, what we know of
Right.
as adobe.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's a tradition of covering those buildings with plaster because
Right.
that protects them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that kind of idea of like covering the building with plaster has continued on to the present day. But now, in a way, it's used to make things look modern, to cover up the materials that are underneath, to make it look like it's a kind of streamlined, straight-edged surface. And so I think in some places, if you leave bricks exposed, for example, and you don't really cover them, the building is considered to be unfinished.
Right.
And
So
then by covering
ambiguous.
it gives it that sort of clean, sort of modern look that people want to have. And so expressing the material is actually not something that's done or accepted.
So what is your biography, and how does that connect to all this work? I mean, you know, we all have our own cultural histories. How did you get into this? And, you know, did you grow up what is your biography? How does it connect?
You know, I grew up in a household with an artist as a parent. So my mother is a painter.
Where did you grow up?
In Arkansas.
Arkansas,
actually.
yeah.
So my mother is a painter. So I grew up and she also taught art at the University of Arkansas. So I grew up my entire life, you know, working with different materials, making things.
I see.
Working with ceramics.
I see.
Doing, you know, all types of drawing, you know, so that was very much part of my childhood. And I also, being from Arkansas, there's also a great tradition there. I don't know if you know.
I do not. This is my education.
So Faye Jones is from there, and
Okay.
Edward Durrell Stone,
Oh,
two fairly well
Edward
known.
Durrell Stone is a high modernist.
Yes, yes. But they also worked with local materials too. So
yeah, Stone's embassies around the world. I remember his
but
embassy.
but you know, he made a whole line of just absolutely gorgeous furniture out of oak barrels, which I was sort of in love with when I was a child. So, you know, the art building actually at the University of Arkansas, it was designed by Ed Stone. So I spent many hours there looking at the architecture. So so there you can really see there's this really cool, in some places, this cool combination of like Ozarks, which is very much, there's a sort of tradition of stone architecture there. And then this combination of modernist architecture.
I see.
So I've just...
So that was your introduction to architecture as a kid, growing up, watching this stuff.
Yeah.
But what was your education? I mean...
well, I have a B.Arch.
No, from where?
From the University of Arkansas. So I studied there.
So was it a modernist education?
Oh, I think it was just a standard sort of studio education.
Yeah.
It was very much, you know, you will go out and have your own practice kind of education. It was back in the day when people could have a practice and do your structural calculations and do your own electric plan. Yeah, exactly. I learned how to do all of that.
Yeah, with the tables.
Yes. So, you know, I learned all of that. And then I graduated, and I just felt like there was something missing from that education that I was sort of unfulfilled. Like, I knew there was more out there. And so a professor of mine, Alejandro Lapunzina, who's just was one of the best professors I've ever had, suggested to me that I go to graduate school. And so I applied to Columbia and ended up going there.
So did Columbia introduce you to traditional materials?
No, actually quite the opposite.
Yeah,
And
sure.
actually that might be the reason why I went back to that later. I had a kind of reaction to going to Columbia. It was fantastic. I did have Kenneth Frampton, and I will
Okay,
say that,
all right.
that, that was, I think he had just finished the studies in tectonic culture. So
the
I
big
was
book,
one of so I was one of the students that took that class like right as he was finishing up the book.
Yeah.
So we were literally sitting there, learning
Okay.
from things about architecture from that book, which was, pretty
Would you
amazing.
describe your interest as sort of how does it connect to and differentiate from Frampton's tectonic culture?
I don't think that he was really. I've thought about that quite a bit, and I think in the end, it just, for me, it's not deep enough in terms of like really getting into understanding
Yeah.
like why the materials were used or selected. And it's very much about, this sort of modernist
Yeah. It's
thing,
sort of a bit
which
distant
it's
appreciation.
just,
Yeah.
and for me, because I consider myself first and foremost an architect, I was really interested in like how exactly is this done,
Yeah.
and also working on projects that where you do have to understand the process.
So
fairly
after
closely.
Columbia, how did you arrive at the doorstep of working with traditional materials?
Well, okay, so I ended up going to Berlin,
Okay.
and so I lived there for about 10 years. I practiced there.
Uh-huh.
And in Berlin, there is a building called the Chapel of Reconciliation,
Okay.
and it was built in the mid-90s in the middle of the no man's land
Okay.
of the Berlin Wall. So a lot of people don't know that the Berlin Wall was actually two walls in a way. One side was a kind of barrier, and the other side was literally the wall that we know as the concrete wall. So this whole area has been redeveloped. It's an area in Berlin called Bernauer Straße, and this chapel was built on the foundations of a church that was destroyed, was like right before the wall fell a couple of years prior. And this chapel was made out of rammed earth.
Oh, I see. Why?
Why? Yeah. So because the congregation, initially it was a competition, and the building that was first proposed was going to be out of concrete, and the congregation had a lot of negative associations with concrete. They associated it with the Berlin Wall. They associated it with the new development that was going on in Berlin.
Right.
And so then the architects decided, okay, we're just going to make this in rammed earth because it gives a sense of presence, but it's temporary in a way. And the congregation really liked that idea that the building wasn't something that was fixed like the wall, something that was concrete.
That's
but
fascinating. So it's a church community that sort of
Yes, yes.
What kind of a church community?
Well, the church community, it was actually divided by the wall, and so there were parts of the congregation that were living in the east and living in the west, and so this would then reunite that congregation.
Through a mud building, rammed earth.
Yes, and the other part of it that I think is really kind of poetic is that they took a lot of the rubble of the church and incorporated it into the rammed earth of the building.
Sure, as aggregate. Quite a bit different from, because Corbusier also put the rubble from the original Notre Dame at Ronchamp in the middle of the walls of Ronchamp. But of course the rest of the structure is concrete, so this is very different.
Yes.
Here it's aggregated.
It has a meaning, you know, and so I was working on Potsdamer Platz at the time, which was this enormous construction site, very high tech, very much about this sort of new Berlin. And then I was just astounded, like, why are they building this chapel in the middle of Berlin out of earth, this really old technology?
Right.
And I started to do more research and to watched it grow, and so it really stuck with me, that idea that there would be a need or a desire in a place like Berlin to build with a material like that, and that it would fulfill a function that a contemporary material couldn't.
So that's fantastic. So we are back to the Seattle question now. We could do this here too.
But there it really had meaning, you know. The thing is it's, you know, none of these projects are kind of forced. It's not like you go in and say like, I absolutely have to do it.
No,
out
they're
of this thing,
liberative
but
in
there
some
was-
sense, yeah, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm concrete obsessed and concrete with my modernist background, with Chandigarh and all this. But these are also prisons of the mind
Right.
and culture.
But even Corbusier was interested in building with earth.
Was he?
Yeah, you didn't know that?
I did not know that.
Oh, yeah.
When did he build
So
it?
he did. He didn't. I don't think he actually ever built anything from earth, if I'm
I don't
remembering
think so.
correctly.
Yeah.
But he had those. He designed the refugee housing
Mm.
that he wanted to make out of pisé, which is like it's pretty much like a compressed earth block.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a little book that I found where there's documentation of. Got it from Berkeley, and I don't remember the name of it, but
We'll find
I
it,
can
yeah.
give you the information. But I was just fascinated. I thought that's so cool. Also, when I started to do research, I was also again like fascinated about, you know, were there then modernist architects that were also interested in these materials? And it turns out, you know, Corbusier was one, and I found some, you know, cases where, you know, things were used, like reeds were used for formwork at the Weissenhof Siedlung and stuff like that.
Mhm.
So,
Of course, in a lot of regional modernism around Southeast Asia, a lot of these materials have been tried in various ways, right?
yeah,
I
of
mean,
course. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of examples,
Yeah.
but, you know, they're not, it's, for me, it's really, again, it's coming back to this idea that it's contemporary and that it's, you know, architectural.
You know, one of the problems with modernism is that it tends to be very secular and pragmatic and materialist, whereas one can read in more traditional cultures, their association with materials can be said to be more cultural and ephemeral and, if you like, spiritual. And I'm very intrigued by this idea that it's a church community that decides that this would be a relevant material, and you go, okay, you don't like concrete, that's fine, but still, why rammed earth, right? Like there is one can read these materials, and if you, you know, rammed earth, I think there's that example, I think that you gave, of bamboo being considered the birthplace of humanity, right? I mean, there's something like that. No, so one can also read a lot of these materials non-pragmatically, right?
Yes, right.
Right? And
Right.
I would argue architecture has a lot to do with beyond pragmatic uses, yes?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah, and I think
Yes.
there's room for that, for sure.
Yeah. And so I'm trying to sort of evoke a question, get you to respond about whether one can access these other sort of, if you like, dimensions of architectural thinking through these kind of material practices. Would you consider that a reasonable line of thinking?
Yeah, I mean they're sort of resonating with meaning, right? And,
Yeah.
And then what do they mean for different people and different cultures? And I think what you're asking is then, can you use that as an architect
Yes.
to create a new type of architecture, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah, it's funny, I've been so focused on the meaning in terms of it being negative that people no longer accept that as a desirable medium for living in, and then architects are going in and trying to change that medium so that people will accept it again. I haven't really thought about if you really tap into that sort of resonance that the material has, that it, I mean, I feel like the Chapel of Reconciliation has that, you know, and actually like the I'm trying to think, not priest, what's the other word for priest? Not in
pastor,
Catholic. Yeah, so
sermon.
the pastor, I was thinking of it, the word in German, but the pastor.
What's the word in German?
I think it's, well, I know
Whatever.
it's like Predigt or.
Yeah.
So in any case, the pastor of that church even referred to the earth as Heilerde.
What does
And
that mean?
Heilerde means healing earth, if you're really going to
Healing earth.
healing earth. And so that there's an ancient tradition. I mean, even now, like people will, you can eat earth, and it has a lot of medicinal properties. It can heal your digestion. I think in some cultures they eat it because it helps you to feel full too. But there are some cultures where you and so in German they actually have a word for it, Heilerde, and you can go into a shop and like buy Heilerde, and it's a kind of medicinal thing that's for your digestion.
So eating architecture.
Yeah, eating architecture.
This is a fantastic dimension to thinking about architecture.
You know, and the other thing too is that these materials, they're political too. There's a political dimension to them as well I think is really important. So there is this slogan that's always stuck in my head that Adobe is political, right? And that you can actually take earth, form it, and then occupy the landscape and claim it, and it becomes yours.
Right.
This is different than what you're talking about, this sort of resonance.
But there's a connection there. I mean, there's a continuity. This idea of, when you build with Adobe, you're building with the body of the earth.
Yeah.
And a lot of cultures and a lot of cultural and spiritual practices, begin around inhabiting the body of the earth. To live is to live in the body of the earth. Chthonic forms of way of thinking versus tectonic, kind of the opposite of tectonic in that sense.
Well, I mean, actually, there's some studies that support that our interaction with the material, so with earth, for example, has shaped our brain. That actually helped us to sort of develop our brain. So whether it's earth or stone, that there was this interaction between us and the material, and that it actually helped us to develop our thinking and thought processes.
Really?
So, yeah.
Say more. What do you mean? I'm not...
Well, so this archaeologist, and she's one that I read quite a bit, and she influenced my thinking. So the idea is that, so what she says is that, and I don't know if it's her idea necessarily, I think it is her idea, but that, working with stone tools, for example, helped us to go from being like a hominoid to being human, that our brain development was actually partially contingent on us interacting with the environment and mainly with materials.
Right.
And so, and that like shaping soil, for example, changed the way that we lived, right? And then that would then help us to develop our...
I mean, the entire Mesoamerican sort of pre-Columbian architecture is about shaping soil, right? I mean, these what we badly call pyramids, they're not pyramids, they're sort of these stepped platform mounds. They don't go anywhere. There isn't anything much on top of them. There's a temple, maybe a site for sacrifice, and some steps. It's the whole effort seems to be dedicated towards accumulating the earth and shaping it and forming it, and communities doing it, and generations of communities doing it. It's about simply forming the material, particularly earth. And people would bring earth from great distances and add it to these great mounds. And you wonder how that connects to their consciousnesses and sort of sense of being in the world. Because we tend to think of architecture as space making, right? Okay, now you have nice space, you have beautiful space, large space, comfortable space, spiritual space, so on and so on. But there's architecture is also simply
But I think
material forming.
If you're thinking about that, that architecture, I don't know, for me it's like I'm not even thinking about space or architecture. That's why I told you I'm not so interested in form.
Right.
It's about this interaction with the material,
I see.
and that like exchange that happens. I think that's so, it's just, I think it's fascinating. I mean, it kind of reminds me of that quote by Richard Sennett. He says that we become, this is just a summarizing of what he says, but that we become interested in things that we know that we can change. You know, so then there's this connection between you and that which we know that we can change or manipulate. Yeah. And that thing is not an inert thing, that it then changes, and then it changes our thinking.
It changes us.
Yeah, and it changes us.
It's a different way of thinking about Louis Kahn's asking the brick what it wants to be.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
It's a sort of a conversation.
You ask the brick what it wants to be, and then you do something with the brick.
Yeah, and then the brick changes you.
Yeah, exactly.
I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It makes me think of being a kid, you know. I remember digging this huge hole, filling it with water, trying to make a bridge over it, and sort of this whole earth structure. Mm-hmm. And kind of the
yeah, I mean, probably everyone has those memories, I'm sure, of like making the mud pie.
Yeah, yeah.
Or mucking around in the puddle.
Yeah, I mean, and we were far inland in Arkansas. Also, you're far inland, but I think a lot of people associate beaches and sort of making things on the beach with all these. With earth and sand which floats around, and the holes and the constructions and the tunnels and the this and the that. These are sort of deeply embedded, embodied human experiences, which get sort of distanced as we grow older and become more abstracted and intellectualized and highly calculated through the economics of space.
Yeah, but I mean, I think all of those natural materials, stone, wood, we've always sort of seen ourselves in them in some way. You know, stone there's so many different cultures that see them as their organs or their spirits, but it's us like looking into that material and somehow seeing ourselves in them too. So again, they're not dead. We're imbuing them with something, and then that is what draws us to them. And I think then again, coming back to your original sort of thought about this architecture of materiality, I mean, I'm sure, I mean, we can probably, if we sat down and thought about it a little bit, we can come up with buildings that have that resonance of the material.
Makes me think of Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, where he talks about his experiences. I don't know if you've read the book.
Yeah, no, I went to see him speak here in Seattle. And I didn't read the book, but I got the gist of it.
Yeah, sure.
The discussion.
About becoming one with well, there's the ego consciousness, which locates me somewhere in my head or somewhere in my body. But then he talks about this consciousness, which you realize there's a sort of general pervasive consciousness to everything, not flowers, trees, but also earth, wind, and you see your own that sort of consciousness pervading everything.
Right.
And that's a way to think about the continuities between the world and us, and therefore the shaping of the world as the shaping of the spirit force of the world, if you like, or the consciousness of the world. It's not just, making inert material slavishly do what you tell it to do.
Right.
It's interacting with consciousness in a particular way.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is it's the part of the research.
I mean, is this crazy thinking, or what do you think?
No, I'm so excited about that and what we're talking about right now, and I would love to write more about that, but I just haven't gotten to it yet. But that's what I don't know. I would love that there is this architecture that does what you're talking about.
I mean, this is frontier of architectural thinking. I mean, we've got to. I mean, I read gender theory. I read. We all read. I feel like everybody is advancing the frontiers of thinking, given our contemporary, re-examination of a lot of things. And what I'm dedicated to, what I'm very interested in, particularly around this podcast, is to, try and take architectural thinking to where it isn't sort of re-celebrating established wisdoms of the greats, but where could we be going? What are the sort of unexplored frontiers? What are the implications of contemporary theory and contemporary issues in the world on this? So that's what I'm interested in. Anyway, thank you for being on Architecture Talk, Elizabeth.
Yeah,
it's been great talking to you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash, your host, and our producer is the one and only Sammy Prouty, a graduate student of architecture here at the University of Washington in Seattle. I hope you all enjoyed our conversation, and if you did, please do take a moment to subscribe and to rate us on iTunes. See you next time. Take care. Goodbye.